Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this new edition of the McDonald Currie Lecture, a yearly public lecture organized by the Institute for the Study of International Development. Before we start, I would like to take a moment to reflect on the place where we're gathering today. While we'll be thinking about big ideas and about the world today, we do so from a specific place, the Faculty Club on the McGill campus. This building was originally a private house built by a wealthy German sugar tycoon. And that house, as well as all the buildings around it, was built on land that was and remains unceded indigenous territory. Indeed, this land, as we often remind ourselves through the practice of land acknowledgements, has for a very long time, and since well before McGill University existed, served as a site of meeting and exchange among indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. So as we talk and think today about globalization and development, let's keep in mind the history of this land we're on and the broader and often uneven trajectories of development that have shaped it. With that in mind, it's my great honor to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Dr. Vera Songwe, who unfortunately could not be here physically with us for reasons outside of her and our control, but who will be with us nonetheless through the wonders of modern technology. So she will be talking on screen today. Dr. Songwe is a globally respected economist, a development finance expert, and senior international leader with deep experience across public, private, and multilateral sectors. She is chair and founder of the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility, a financial mechanism designed to improve liquidity for emerging markets and support sustainable development and climate finance. She also served as a senior advisor to the Bank for International Settlements, focusing on financial stability, credit risk cycles, and regulatory innovation. Dr. Songwe previously held the highest regional leadership position at the United Nations, serving as Undersecretary General and Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. In this role, she became the first woman to lead the organization in its 60 years history, driving strategic reforms on macroeconomic stability, private sector growth, development finance, and the African Continental Free Trade Area. Her career includes senior leadership positions at the World Bank and the International Finance Corporation, where she managed multi-billion-dollar portfolios and championed fiscal policy, economic governance, and innovative financing for development across Africa and beyond. Dr. Songwe has been consistently recognized among Africa's most influential leaders by outlets such as the Financial Times, Forbes, Jeune Afrique, and others. After Dr. Songwe's lecture, we'll be joined by a panel of equally great speakers. Tom Bui, who is sitting here at the front with the other panelists from Global Affairs Canada, Lisa Corbiel from the Joint SDG Fund, and Andy Ouedraogo from Coopération Canada. The panel will be centered around the question of the future of international development. This will be moderated by Krishna Novak, one of our professors of practice at ISID, and Gabriela Flashberger, a member of the IDSSA, the International Development Studies Student Association, a representative. So you'll hear more from them and get a proper introduction of our panelists after the keynote address. We'll also have a reception after the event at 6 p.m. There will be some delicious food and some drinks. You can get a ticket for the drinks from Cheryl at the reception if you didn't already. So we hope that you stick around, if anything, for all of that. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Songwe.
Thank you very much. Let me start first of all by thanking Professor Yann Le Poulain de Wahou, who is the associate professor, and also, of course, the Institute for the Study of International Development and the Department of Geography for inviting me for this lecture today. McGill University, of course, Coopération Canada, and Global Affairs Canada. And then also I want to apologize sincerely for not being with you in the room. Really, like I said to Professor Yann Le Poulain, it is ce n'est qu'une partie remise. I hope to be able to come again. I think the stars were not aligned, whether it was the weather or whether it was the planes, for us to be with you today, and whether it's retreat or migration, and the conversations that we're all having. I think, but it is really, really a pleasure for me to have been invited to be with you and to have the conversations around globalization and security, which are a particularly important conversation that we're all having today across the globe around what's happening in the world. And I want to make a case to you. The talk that I am proposing to you is a talk around security and the new re-globalization. I want, particularly as I'm talking to students, to sort of be optimistic as I see it. And you can see my, let's see, that's not what I want to do. I'm going to take out the subtitles. I thought we took them out. Back again. Oh, they're gone. Okay. So I'm going to talk about security and re-globalization. This always happens. I'm very happy to be with you for this McDonald Currie Lecture, which ended up with globalization. So imagine April 1. If you start on April 1, you will have a sense that the world was in total retreat. Of course, some call it Liberation Day. Others have less flattering names for it. But that was the day the United States rolled out sweeping reciprocal tariffs across the board, 10%. It's now 15% baseline on all imports, which dramatically increased higher targets for many countries. Of course, you can see it was 10, 15% for many, but for Canada, it was 35. For India, it was 25. For Switzerland, it was 39 and others. And for Lesotho, it was 47. And as we know, Lesotho is a transshipment stop for clothing and textiles coming from China, even though Lesotho certainly does not have trade surplus with the United States. If you imagine the map of the world on March 31st, so April 1st was the day the tariffs were rolled out. But if you take a step back and you imagine a map of the world on March 31st, what you would see essentially was, trade lines that went from the United States to China, China to Europe, and Europe back to the United States. So there were sort of big trade lines. There were three hegemons in the world, and that's what was happening with global trade. We all remember April 1 because it happened so suddenly, it was in your face. But even before April 1, we had already begun to see retreats, and I kept this on because India already, before April 1, was already banning and protecting the exports of rice. China, of course, beginning in 2023, had already begun itself to restrict global trade. China began restricting exports of gallium, uranium, antimony, and other rare minerals. It started banning exports in 2024 of even more rare minerals to the United States, to Japan, and to the Netherlands. And in early 2025, it expanded the exports to tungsten, indium, bismuth, and tellurium. Most of us don't know the names of these rare minerals, but these rare minerals are critical rare minerals. Then we didn't know how critical they were, but today we know that they are even more critical because fighter jets, for example, if one were to put fighter jets in the air, you need about 900 pounds of rare earth elements to be able to actually power a fighter jet. You need an equivalent amount of rare earth minerals to be able to hold cell phones that you have. Most of them have these minerals in them. And so essentially, trade protection, trade restrictions were already beginning to happen before April 1. And I've shown you both from the United States, of course, but also from India and from China. And so what was happening, I think, when April 1 happened, I think there was a huge awakening of this event. And everybody realized then that, the trade as we knew it before was no longer going to be the trade that will continue to be. But we did not see retreat as is usually discussed. What we actually saw was the thick lines that I talked about around trade, United States to China, China to Europe, and Europe back to the United States. those thick lines of trade thinned out. And what we had is a new series of sort of global highways, if you want to sort of picture them, that reappeared, of trade no longer just going through those highways, but now going through a multitude of increased different lines of trade. We had now trade not happening because of comparative advantage. And of course, I'm talking to students and students of economics, students of geography. But in economics, we would say that it became a little bit of a tension between Ricardo and Krugman. Who will win? Comparative advantage, supply chains, and can we improve and can we reorder or redirect our supply chains? What was important at the lens that was driving this change and this new changes post 2025, or if you remember, was the president of the United States wanted to create jobs. In Europe, you want to create jobs. In China, China has been growing at 10%. China's growth was contracting. We're 4.5. China needed to re-stimulate its economy. So essentially, around the world, the lens behind a lot of the activity that was happening, the tariffs and the trade bans and export bans, was really around trying to see whether one could relocalize jobs. So it was no longer about comparative advantage. It was about jobs and it was about security. This new jobs and security lens did not optimize and will not optimize efficiency as we no, using resilience. And some of this was because of COVID as well. And we all remember, the flights carrying PPEs from Asia into Canada that got brought down in the United States because the United States needed the material. So the world was beginning to become, if you look at it from that perspective, more nationalistic and closing in. But when you look at job security and security, pure security, we do not get good economics. We do not get optimal economics. So the standard textbooks, and this is the Krugman versus Ricardo conversations, no longer applies. Tariff levels at 15% between allies is better than the alternative, but they are not zero. Friendshoring means that you pay more to have your semiconductor being produced by a friend as opposed to being produced by the cheapest partner, which means, of course, the conversation around affordability stays in the limelight. But here's the other side of that coin. Some of the old agreements that are being broken were themselves not that efficient. They just wore the disguise of efficiency. When one country subsidizes its exports, manipulates its currency, steals intellectual property, and wars its own markets while demanding access to yours, this is not free trade, like the Common Agricultural Policy, for example, for Africa. So this was a rigged game, dressed up in the language of free trade, and the fact that it was codified in agreements of fair trade did not mean that it was necessarily fair or that it was correct. Therefore, the dislocations that we are seeing today, or the unmasking that we are seeing, is essentially a recorrection of a lot of the inequities that paraded for a values-based system that still was a system that was based on the large highways, United States to Europe, Europe to China, China back to the United States. And so, yes, the security lens may produce some suboptimal outcomes, but it is also sweeping away arrangements that were themselves deeply flawed. And in their place, something new and genuinely more competitive could emerge. It hasn't emerged yet, but there is a potential that it could emerge. And we're beginning to see some new indications about how that could happen. And I'll come back to this, for example, between the EU and the Mercosur trade agreement. And the competitive arguments that is being put on the table. I mentioned the Common Agricultural Policy. One of the biggest constraints of the Common Agricultural Policy for Africa was that agriculture trade with Europe was constrained. Now with EU and Mercosur, the biggest discussion, which is now graduated and is going to be a phased-in discussion, is around opening agricultural trade products. If we're successful in opening those products with trade between EU and the Mercosur, then of course Africa will benefit as well. So we begin to see a slightly more opening. But nowhere is it more visible, the trade discussions, as it is in the critical mineral space. Critical minerals, of course, have become one of the biggest subjects across the board. In the United States, there has been in particular, a reordering of the critical minerals. Now we have 60 minerals that the U.S. Geological Survey has classified as critical minerals, minerals that are important for the economy, minerals that are important for national security. Canada has also done the same. The United States is 100% dependent on 12 of these critical minerals, and more than 50% rely on imports for 29% of the critical minerals. So in this changing trade and global environment, even if you decided that you wanted to renationalize or relocalize everything that you need, you cannot renationalize and relocalize what you don't have. And so essentially what the only options that countries have is to find new alliances. And that is where Canada has been a big leader, because in the Alberta Summit, Canada proposed the G7 Critical Minerals Action Plan, where essentially we had new alliances that had never before been formed. They have always been there, and there has always been trade between them, but not trade in critical minerals, and not at this level. $6.4 billion of new trade was launched under the G7 Critical Minerals Action Plan, with Canada now, trading more with Ukraine, Ontario with Germany and the United States, Australia, doing more with General Motors. And this was a group of G7 countries that came together and said, well, China, as we saw in the first earlier slides, is closing down its economy. Let's create new partnerships. Let's create new trade corridors, new supply chain corridors, which will allow us to still access the kinds of minerals that are needed for production and for growth. Canada has not only done that. As we know, Canada's globalization drive has been accelerating. Canada, of course, as you remember, had 35% of the tariffs in the early slides. So what did Canada do? Canada has now expanded its trade agreements. Canada, as we see, is going to India. It's making trade agreements with India. Was just finished concluding discussions with So there's Canada and Mexico are rediscussing what is going to happen under the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. It is going to come up for renewal in 2027. Canada has said to the United States, we cannot guarantee you that you're going to have access to our rare minerals, but we know that we need more, so we're going to go and find new trade partners. And so, of course, Canada just went to China as well and had a trade deal with China, allowing for 49,000 EV vehicles to come into Canada and begin to exchange technology between China and Canada, not only on EV vehicles, but there is also conversations around agriculture, which hitherto China and Canada were not discussing. And so essentially what we see is even Canada, that we think is closing in because there are more tariffs, as of course, Prime Minister Macron's speech in the WEF at Davos explained, is expanding its new trade alliances, is looking for new trade partners. It is not becoming a middle power, and I do not think that Canada wants to become a middle power. I think Canada is always going to stay a G7 partner. I think what the middle powers are trying to do is get into the G7 space and play in that space. And I think this is an area where we do need to begin to think about it, because today there's a lot of conversations around middle powers and whether everybody wants to become a middle power. The reverse of the coin of the middle powers is the middle income trap. Many of these countries that we call middle powers are stuck in the middle income trap. They all want to get into the G7 or into the G20. And so essentially, hopefully, with this redirection of trade, we can actually see an unleashing of better prosperity and increased wealth in these countries, and actually an accession of these countries from middle powers, which in the long term is not a celebratory term, into real G7, G20 economies, diversifying hegemony across a larger multiplicity of geographies. Now, what is happening as we talk about trade in Africa in particular? And I've talked about what's happening in the United States and what's happening in Canada. What's happening in the United States and Africa and China is we're seeing a United States that had retreated from Africa, and a China that had come into Africa substantially. Trade with between the United States and Africa is only 64 billion. Trade between China and Africa is 280 billion. A lot of it is critical minerals. Now, with the critical minerals drive, the United States is actually coming back again into Africa. Canada has more or less, in terms of trade with the continent, 7 billion of exports to the continent, 9 billion of imports from the continent. So there is a trade deficit. Canada has a trade deficit with Africa. So if Canada was the United States, they would impose tariffs on us. Canada, essentially, the big commodities that Canada trades with Africa, South Africa, Nigeria, and Algeria is mostly petroleum products. Ghana is gold, Morocco is phosphates, and Mauritania is copper. So we begin to see the critical minerals conversation also coming into Africa. And the question is, yes, there is a G7 mineral alliance, but is there a conversation once Prime Minister Makani goes to India and goes to China, that maybe a next trip should be in Africa, where there is a substantial amount of critical minerals, because Canada is making the strategic move of saying we want to find and we want to secure more rare minerals, and not doing a pivot to the continent, to Africa, may also disadvantage Canada. Actually, the United States, on the other hand, has made a huge pivot into Africa, huge investments today of the United States in DRC, in Zambia, in Angola. There is a big Lobito corridor investment that the United States is putting in place in the East Africa belt. We believe actually that because Canada does not have any of the stresses and the weight and the burden of history with it. And actually, in some cases, the familiarity of language in Francophone Africa, I'm speaking essentially to Francophone Canada, that there is actually a huge opportunity. Canada is a mining country, it's a lot of technology that it can share with Africa. And so there is actually a case that Canada may be leaving huge opportunities on the table in this reordering of the global trade environment if it does not also look at coming and turning its sights on the continent, as the United States of America is doing. Canada is a leader in climate change, so it does come with that added advantage. It could Prime Minister Makani has been a leader on the climate change front and can continue to be a leader if we had trade turned in that direction. As we turn trade in the direction of more diversity, I think what that is creating, and remember in the beginning I talked about the fact that it was security and jobs that are really beginning to push this new realignment in the world. Jobs have an important place in the conversation. Mineral security at its core actually is a job strategy. Every mine, every processing facility, every recycling operation, every battery plant that comes online today anywhere in the world is about creating jobs, is about manufacturing, it's about long-term employment. So we started with jobs, we closed in, then we expanded because we were looking for critical minerals, and we ended up again with jobs. And that is the cycle, in some sense, of the re-globalization. It's a re-globalization. In Africa, we said we had a period of 15 years of growth with no jobs. So it was jobless growth. But the critical minerals conversation and the climate conversation put together, because the critical minerals conversation is also a climate conversation, is an improvement in energy security, is actually delivering jobs in its wake and so essentially one way to look at that combination together, we are actually going through a positive period in economic development where we are seeing huge expansion, huge new trade agreements that are being formed. ASEAN is reinventing itself. It's looking at new manufacturing alternatives. Vietnam's trade with the United States has surged. India and China, that used to be rivals in the 2020s, have now become better friends, partly because, of course, of the American tariffs, but partly because they are seeing a new opportunity. Africa that came together to do the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement is providing a big platform, the largest free trade area agreement in the world. It's providing a huge platform for better trade. I talked about China, Canada, Mexico, India, China, ASEAN. All these new power centers that are being created, Brazil, India, Indonesia, Mexico, have all now become part of the global conversation in terms of how we restructure and reorder the new global trade environment. And so the re-globalization that was essentially ordered around three nodes has become one that is around many more, less concentrated, more diverse superhighways that are running together. The most unexpected consequence of this perceived closing down or anti-globalization movement has been actually a disruption that is inadvertently reopening the world. When the old system did not work, we had, countries, the old system was defined where a few countries were at the table. We have pictures of, predominantly Western countries at the table deciding WTO rules that were written only for advanced countries. Developing nations were mostly passengers in that conversation. Now, what we have is new alliances that are being formed. These new alliances are defining how they want themselves to see and operate and exchange with each other. However, the biggest problem, and this is a problem, again, that I leave with you as students, hopefully, of both actually the politics of geography, but also, and this is the AGOA at risk, but the Americans have decided, we all thought at some point that AGOA was going to get closed, but the Americans have decided that they wanted actually to reinvigorate AGOA. But rather than reinvigorate it the way it was before, they've pivoted to critical minerals and health. And so essentially penalizing countries that were trading with China more and rewarding countries that have critical minerals and are trading with the United States more. And now all these countries have a seat at the table. They can actually work to reorder the new global environment. And Canada should come to the table and look at, this is the trade between Canada, Africa, and the United States and China, and where Canada falls in that space. Yes, some of it has increased, but not as much. And I think as Africa sits at the table and is able to have a pure and real conversation on trade, Canada wants to come and become a partner of it. The alternative of these conversations that we have now and the new diversification is not to say that we want to have only bilateral trade. I'm going in the wrong direction with my slides, but is to look at what can we do in a multilateral system that allows for Africa and other developing countries to begin to also contribute in redefining a new trade framework. And that's where the WTO is probably the most important standing multilateral organization today, because we know that when the world trades with each other, the world reduces poverty much faster. We have seen the fastest increases in poverty reduction have happened when the world is trading with each other and when developing countries trade with developed countries. So we do not want a dislocation of that, but we want a reordering of that, of those trade negotiations and how they can happen. The good news is that the WTO meetings are about to happen. And what we are beginning to see, the new trade architecture that is coming up, is something now that is called constructive incrementalism, which essentially means we don't have everybody sitting together at the table and agreeing a la WTO until everybody agrees we don't move forward, but saying we can have small subsets of countries that agree, and then if once there is agreement, we move forward. And if we remember correctly, even though constructive incrementalism may sound like it's a new theory, it really is not. The original 1947 General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was the beginning of the WTO, only had 23 countries when it started. It was meant to be temporary, just a stopgap to sort of get the world stabilized. Today, that stopgap temporary GATT is now 164 countries, right? 6 European countries created the Coal and Steel Community in 1951. Today, we have the European Union with a much larger group of participants. The WTO, one of the most important on intellectual information technology agreement, and this is of age, right? The ITA, as you see there, started with only 29 members, and today it has 82 members and covering 97% of global IT trade. That is why the United States has not yet left the WTO, because information technology, AI, and the governance of information technology and AI is actually what is going to define and determine growth in the next decades to come. And so essentially, 70% of global trade still happens on WTO platforms. I think this is the strongest vote that we do need a multilateral system that can still regulate and provide a governance framework for trade. However, we are also agreeing that we cannot continue to trade in one hegemonious framework. And so this constructive incrementalism allows for countries that agree together on a few critical issues to start a coalition that others can then join. And I spoke earlier on about the G7 Critical Minerals Coalition, for example, that Canada has led, which is now growing. It started with 7 countries. It is now 14 countries, and all of the EU has joined it. Brazil just started a climate and trade forum, which is also continuing to grow. So essentially, what I want to leave with you is that even though the conversations around global trade appear to be all about recession and everybody being more nationalistic, we are seeing and witnessing the fastest expansion in global trade that we have ever seen, which means essentially, well done. If there was trade with equity, we will also be witnessing a fastest period of prosperity and growth that we have ever seen in the last few decades. And so essentially, it is a positive story. It is a positive story that we're living. Now, what we need to do is make sure that we are able to define the new set of WTO conversations, which are going to be around issues on subsidies, a new set of conversations that we need to have on how we redefine global trade. This is the rush. I think all of these charts are just showing you it doesn't matter how you look at it. These are the different trade corridors. We have expanded. We have 30% new trade corridors that have been reestablished. So the big, thick lines have become many small lines connecting each other. 30% more new lines in trade agreements are beginning to happen. In the WTO, when we go to Cameroon, my country, how do we begin to grow the new seeds of a new system? A system that is incremental, a system that allows for people to come in slowly. One is no more consensus, incrementalism. Will incrementalism work? Those of you who are studying game theory can come back to us with, what kinds of coalitions will work and what will not work. Food security, of course, is a very big one. Every country needs and is discussing food security. I think many of you will remember Donald Trump saying that Japan doesn't buy American rice, and why do we have to buy American rice? But it's so much subsidies, but food security, agriculture, and climate change are now coming together, and we need to make sure that regulation around that works. Subsidies, there are different kinds of subsidies. We need to be able to differentiate good subsidies from bad subsidies and then see how you change them. These are difficult issues that need multilateralism, that need partnerships, but we cannot do them as we did them before with total consensus. We're going to have to find incremental solutions for that. And so hopefully in Cameroon, in the next 2.5 weeks, actually, we will be able to continue to build this global system that is paying off, that continues to grow, as we have seen, despite the strong headwinds that are ahead of us. And so essentially, for those who have told you that the system is collapsing, that the system is broken, and trade as you knew it is gone, and fragmentation is the new order, fortunately enough, that's not the case. We have more diversification, we have more inclusiveness, we have greater trade. And as we say, there is an old West African proverb, when the fall of a great tree makes room for the sun to reach the forest and the floor, which means everybody else. And so the tensions between the United States, Europe, and China is actually allowing much faster growth, and hopefully that we get better prosperity. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Songwe, for a thought-provoking talk. We have time for right about 2 questions before we move on to the panel. And there's a mic right here if anyone wants to get up and ask Dr. Songwe a question. Yes, I see someone hesitantly getting up and going towards the mic.
First off, thank you for that talk. It's definitely really interesting, and it's a new perspective. I had a question about sort of the attitude that the U.S. is going to have during this entire thing. So recently, like, I think it was the Deputy Secretary of State, Christopher Landau, who said that, you know, they're going to do like trade agreements with India, but they're not going to make the same mistake that they made with China in allowing it to, you know, rise to like a peer competitor. Do you think there's going to be issues on that front? Or do you think they're going to follow the same free trade strategy that sort of gave them China, I guess? Or does their opinion on this not matter as much as it used to?
I think yes and no. I think 2 things that are happening. First of all, now the United States is eager to get into a full agreement with India because everybody else is, right? It took almost 25 years for India and Europe to finalize their trade agreement. But for 25 years, they couldn't do it. And within 1 year, because of April 1, they got into a trade agreement. And so essentially, the United States is now seeing itself almost being locked out of a market that they want to get into. That takes us to AI. Remember that a lot of your iPhones are also produced partially in India. And so if you don't do that, I think this is where the Krugman-Ricardo conversation happens, right? Because Ricardo was competitive advantage. Krugman is supply chains, which means different particles of different things are produced most optimally someplace else, but the whole thing then is produced globally. And so if you decide that you want to stay out of that supply chain, then it penalizes your product. And so essentially, I don't think that the United States, as we saw with China, by the way, United States had to renege on a couple of tariffs that it put on China because it just could not afford to stay out of the magnetic field if China was going to impose tariffs on it. So I think what is going to end up happening is still my argument, and I did a paper on this before, is eventually we're going to end up in a competitive space, even though now we are doing security as sort of the engine for competition. And so the United States businesses that need to deliver value to their shareholders are going to continue looking for competition and efficiency.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you. Is there another question before we move on to the panel? Oh, I don't know if this mic is, oh, there we go. Okay. I was just going to ask you if you wanted to elaborate a little bit on the role of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, on the dynamics that you described. You described kind of the role of security and supply chain security in some of these changes. And you mentioned the pandemic briefly, but I wonder if you want to elaborate a little bit on the role of that factor.
I think what happened during the pandemic was a little bit the beginning of the realization of how pure comparative advantage and optimization of supply chains had created enormous dependencies. And let me take the case of Africa. 95% of Africa's pharmaceutical products came from abroad, about 50% from Europe and another 50% from India, and even worse, from one factory in India. And so essentially during the pandemic, when one factory closes down, you have no access. If you take the COVID vaccines, a lot of the reagents for the COVID vaccine, one of the reagents came from South Africa for all of the vaccines that were produced actually in Europe. And so when Europe wakes up one morning and the South African factory can no longer deliver, then they are in trouble. And I think these kinds of security dependencies came to light during the pandemic, and people realized you cannot be fully dependent on one source for your production. And so one then begins to look at how can you diversify. But diversification of your sources of inputs into your value chain does not necessarily mean inefficiency. So what you can do is, because essentially if what we ended up with one company doing everything well, and so everybody went there. But there is an argument that says that you can have three companies doing it equally well and equally efficiently. And what we've seen now is clearly China is doing it, India is doing it, Vietnam is doing it, and Senegal is doing it, right? And so you can diversify your supply without necessarily compromising efficiency. And so I think these are some of the conversations that one is having. The other conversation is, yes, when I diversify my supply, do I want to do it with a friend? Do I want to do it with a reliable partner? And so I think that's the additional layer that has come up since COVID, is we need a reliable partner. But as you can see, unfortunately, because of the war in Iran, we have now reopened trade with Russia and India, because there would be some commodities where you have a limited set of geographies that produce it and or that can trade it at a particular point in time. And so one will then eventually have to be suboptimal from a security perspective so that you're optimal on an economic perspective. If we don't open the routes between Russia and, I think this is the American argument, if you don't open the routes between Russia and India and then India into China, we're going to have oil prices at $200 a barrel.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Songwe. Thanks again. We don't have time for more questions, unfortunately. I see a raised hand, but we should move on to the panel. So I want to, again, extend my sincere thanks on behalf of ICID and of everyone here, and hope that next time you can join us in person. Yeah, thank you again, Dr. Songwe.
Merci beaucoup pour l'invitation et j'espère vous voir très prochainement. Merci encore de plus.